In this video, I want to go ahead and take a look at the different CSS selectors that we're going to encounter with an HTML page. So to start with, I want to start with an empty HTML page, and then I want to walk you through the different types of selectors that we're going to encounter and you're going to be expected to know. And then with those CSS selectors, we'll be able to apply different CSS rules to them to style the really targeted group of HTML elements that you want based on the CSS selector. Okay, so I think we'll get the idea of it once we go through a few examples. So I want to start with an HTML page. So I'm using an HTML template here, and I'm going to go ahead and save this page right away on my desktop in a folder called Web Pages. So I've already got the CSS Selectors project set up with the various subfolders that we're interested in. And I'm going to go ahead and save this as index.html. Okay, so this is the starting point. And the first selector I want to talk about is an ID selector. I'm going to go through a couple of different selectors. So we'll start with ID selectors, then we'll talk about tag name selectors or CSS element selectors, and then we'll get into class selectors. So we'll first talk about those three things, and then we'll talk about pseudo selectors, and then what I really want to convey to you though is that it takes some practice to get into what type of selector is appropriate at the right time. So for instance, if I want to style one element, then I might want to use an ID selector, but if I want to style a group of elements, I might want a class selector, and maybe at one point you want to use a list item selector, but in the future you might not want that style rule applied to all your list items. You might want it only applied to list items within a certain unordered list. So it takes some practice applying these CSS selectors. So the title of this is going to be CSS Selectors, and we're starting with an ID selector. So with an ID selector, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with an element that has an ID. So I'll start with an h1 tag, and my h1 tag is going to have an ID called main heading, and my main heading is going to be my main heading. And I want to style this particular h1 tag based on the fact that I have an ID of main heading. So I have an ID attribute and the value is main heading. So I want to style this h1 tag based on the fact that that ID is main heading. So I'm going to create a style sheet that allows me to select this h1 tag based on the fact that the ID is main heading. So in order to do that, I'm going to have an external style sheet. One thing I didn't mention, so in the last video we talked about how there's three different ways we can apply styles. So we could use inline styles, we can use internal styles, and we can use external styles. For the purpose of this class, we're going to be using external styles exclusively. So no inline styles, no internal styles. We're going to be using external styles exclusively. Okay, so we have a style sheet, and it's going to be found in our style sheets folder. And then we're going to have master.css. It's not there yet, so I'm going to go ahead and create it. So in my style sheets, I'm going to have a new file called master.css. And we had talked about selecting this h1 tag based on the fact that the ID is main heading. So the way I would reference that element is I use a pound sign and then the ID that I want to select. And what we're saying is that this style rule applies to any HTML element that has an ID that has a value of main heading. Okay, and for this screencast, I don't necessarily care what styling rule we have, but what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and just change the color. So I'm going to change the color, and I'm going to use a new syntax here, which is RGBA. And what the RGBA function does is it tells us how much red, how much green, how much blue, and then how much alpha. And alpha is the transparency. So the red is a value from 0 to 255. So 0 being no red, 255 being all red. The green is how much green would get added, 0 to 255 again. The blue is 0 to 255 again. And then the alpha is how much transparency, and that's a value from 0 to 1. So let's go ahead and make this a semi-transparent red color. So we're going to do 255, 0, 0, 0.5 for the alpha. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and launch our package. We're going to launch our Atom Live server. It's going to bring up our directory. We're going to go into our web pages, and you can see our main heading has some transparency, and I can change that so it's red and it's semi-transparent. I can change that transparency setting. So right now it's half transparent, and I might say that I don't want any transparency to all the way down to mostly transparent. Okay, so that's what that alpha setting is. It's a value from 0 to 1. Notice it's all red because I said I want all red, no green, no blue, and then mostly transparent. I'm going to just do semi-transparent, and that can be any value between 0 and 1 for alpha. Okay, if I want to mix colors, so if I want red and green, I can do that. Changes over to a yellowish. It's hard to see, hard to read, but the idea is that these values are anywhere from 0 to 1. Okay, I'm just going to go with the semi-transparent red for the main heading. The idea here, though, is that we're selecting an element based on the fact that it has an ID attribute and the value is main heading. So we're using this pound sign to select the element that has that matching ID. Okay. Next, if we go back over to our HTML, I'm going to go ahead and have another heading, so it's going to be an H3 heading. And this time I'm going to go ahead and add a class attribute, and the class that I'm going to have is subheading. And then I'm going to have a couple of these just to kind of illustrate the point or where we'd use this class subheading. Sub1, and then I'm just going to copy and paste this. Sub2 and sub3. So 3 different subheadings, all having that class identifier of subheading. Okay, so I want to style all 3 of those H3 tags. And the way I'm going to style all 3 of those H3 tags is I want to select all of the elements that have that class called subheading. So I'm going to use a class selector in my CSS. So over in my CSS, I want to select all of those elements that have that particular class called subheading. So I use the dot notation to say that I'm talking about a class that has an attribute value of subheading, and then here's how I'm going to define all of the style rules for that subheading. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to change the color, and I'm going to use that RGBA syntax again, and in this case I'm going to make it green. So no red, all green, no blue, and again we can do semi-transparent. Okay, and then we're going to skip back over to our browser, and you'll see that my subheadings, sub1, sub2, sub3, all of those elements that have that class identifier of subheading are going to be green. And here's how this gets interesting is if I go over to my index.html, right now we have these H3 tags that are subheadings, but I could also go ahead and say I want to have an article that has a class of subheading. And then I type some text here. Here is some text for my article. And what we'll see is that it's also going to be green. Okay, so even though it's not a heading tag, because it has that class identifier, now it's going to match that CSS selector because the CSS class attribute is equal to subheading. And because it has that class attribute of subheading, then the CSS selector kicks in and says, hey, this color should be green. Okay. And then the third main selector that we're going to use is a tag-based selector or an HTML element selector. So in order to do this, I'm going to go ahead and have an unordered list and then some list items. So item 1, item 2, item 3 and 4. And what I want to do is I want to use a CSS selector to select all of the list items that are on my HTML page. So in this case, I want all of these list items, and what I'm going to do is just going to make them blue. Okay, so I'm going to go over to my master.css file, and I'm going to use a HTML element selector or a tag name selector. So what I'm doing is I'm saying I want all of the HTML elements that have a tag name of li. And what we're talking about there, what we're going to capture there, is we're going to capture all of these list items that I have highlighted. Okay, so that's what we're defining by this CSS rule. We're going to say that the color, and this time we're just going to use RGB with no alpha. So modern browsers support transparency, but not older browsers. So there was an RGB function. The idea is the same, a value from 0 to 255, indicating how much red, how much green, how much blue. So if I'm going to make this blue, I'm just going to go ahead and say that it's blue. And all of the list items then would become blue. Okay? So these are the main CSS selectors that we would end up dealing with. So the first one being an ID-based selector. The second one being a class-based selector. And then the third one being an HTML element selector. Okay, so those are the three main ones that we're going to be dealing with as CSS selectors, and then we can apply our style rules accordingly. So I want you to keep in mind that these are the three main CSS selectors, and then we have examples for that in our HTML. But here I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball into this. So I have these 4 items. They're blue right now because of the HTML element selector. So I said all list items should be blue. Here's where the curveball comes in. What if I have another unordered list and I have items? So maybe these are grocery items. So I want pizza and beer and bread. Okay, so my grocery list, I don't want my grocery list to be blue. Okay, but because of my CSS selector and the way I wrote my CSS selector, you'll notice that it is blue. Maybe I wanted my grocery list to be some other color. Maybe I wanted it to be black, or I wanted it to be whatever. I wanted the default value. I didn't want it to be blue. Okay, so it doesn't matter what color you want, but right now it's trapped in the color blue because of my CSS selector saying that all list items should have the color blue. Okay, so that's what this rule is saying. All list items, regardless of what list they're in, should be blue. Okay, but what I'm suggesting is that my grocery list here, so lines 26 through 30, should be a different color. It doesn't matter what color it is, but this is my grocery list. So I'm going to go ahead and make this list identified as my grocery list. Okay, so I'm putting an ID attribute on there, saying that it's my grocery list. Okay, by doing that, what it does is it allows me to get more granular on my CSS selectors. So for instance, maybe I want to make these list items a different color, but these list items should remain blue. So the idea here in this example would be all list items are blue, but I want this specific grocery list set of list items to be some other color. Okay? So the way I'm going to do that is if I go over to my CSS, I can then get more specific. I can do a combination of an ID selector and an HTML element selector. So I can start to combine these three different types of selectors, ID, class, HTML element. I can start combining them to say more specific things. So in our case, I'm talking about my grocery list items. So those list items that are in that grocery list should have a different color. Okay, and the color that I want them to have is going to be some kind of mixture. I think this will come out as gray. Okay, so now you'll notice that my grocery list items now have a new style attribute applied because my CSS selector got more granular. So I'm not saying I want a specific element. I'm saying that I want a specific element, and then within that element, I want the list items in particular. So it's a combination of an ID-based selector and an HTML element-based selector. And we can do that with all of them. So for instance, I might want to highlight some list items. Okay, so I'm just going to continue the theme of these list items. And the way I'm going to handle this is I'm going to give each one of these list items a class of highlighted. Okay, and I'm just going to copy and paste that a couple times. And let's assume these are cities. So Verona, Madison, Waunakee, and Sun Prairie. Okay, so these are some of the cities around Dane County. They're all highlighted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this unordered list an ID of cities. And then I can say that these highlighted cities should have a specific color. Let's go ahead and add another list item that's not highlighted. So I'm just going to go ahead and have a list item that's not highlighted, so I don't have that class identifier, and that's going to be Mount Horeb. Okay, so I have a list of cities. 4 of them are highlighted, 1 of them is not highlighted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I care about the cities, and specifically I want the highlighted cities, and I'm going to go ahead and change the color. So again, just some value, 200, 200, 200. And the idea here is that for some reason I missed this. I want the cities, and then I want the elements that are highlighted. There we go. I had the CSS selector wrong. So I want the cities, and I left off a space that have a, and then within cities I want the elements that have a class of highlighted. And we're changing that color to some other variant of gray. Okay, and you'll notice that Mount Horeb didn't get caught in that mix. And the reason Mount Horeb didn't get caught in that mix is because Mount Horeb didn't have that class identifier of highlighted. Okay, and we might do something like, let's make it the background color. Okay, that's how we're highlighting it, and we can go even further. Maybe we want this to be some kind of yellow, so I'm not going to use an RGB color value. I'm just going to say I want this to be yellow because it's highlighted. Now it looks more like a highlighter. Okay, so background color refers to the background of the element. Color refers to the foreground of the element. So if we want this highlighted, we might make it a yellow background and red text. So we can set the color to red. And now we're changing both the background and foreground colors. Okay. Again, for the purposes of this screencast, what we really care about is now we're using a combination of CSS selectors. So not only do we have an ID-based selector, but we're combining that to say we want to be more granular. So we're talking about within an element that has an ID of cities, we're looking for elements that also have a class identifier of highlighted. Okay, and then we're going to apply this style rule. Okay. The idea is fairly simple. There's really three main types of selectors: an ID-based selector, a class-based selector, and an HTML element selector. And then we can combine those selectors to get really specific about the HTML elements that we want to select. Okay, so any combination of the three can then combine to make a more granular selector or a more targeted selector. One other thing that we want to cover is, let's say I have some paragraphs, hello, and then a div, and I don't need a class here, but I want a div, hello again, and then I have an article, again, no need for a class. And I'm picking all unique elements, so this is the first time these would show up. Hello, hello again. And then maybe I have a section. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so I have 4 different kind of unique elements on the page, and I want to select them all and make them a certain color. What I can do is I can select all of the paragraph tags. So I'm using a HTML element selector. Then I can go ahead and select my div. Then I can go ahead and select my articles and my sections. So this style rule is going to apply to all of those different types of HTML elements. Okay, and I'm separating them by commas. So what I have is I have a CSS selector, I have another CSS selector, another CSS selector, and another CSS selector. So I have 4 different unique selectors, and the idea is that this style rule would apply to any element that matches any of those selectors. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say that I want the foreground color to be cornflower blue. Okay, and you'll notice that all 4 of those different HTML elements, so whether it was the paragraph tag or the div tag or the article or the section, all of them have that cornflower blue text. So I'm selecting all of them, so I'm selecting anything that's a paragraph tag or a div or an article or a section, and I'm making it cornflower blue. Okay, and whether that's the foreground color or the background color or how I express the color, whether it's an RGB value or a non-RGB value, it's just an actual color name. I think there's 140 different colors that we could use, or I could use hexadecimal notation. And I don't want to get into hexadecimal notation. It's covered in kind of the external resources for this week. So I can express colors in a lot of different formats. But really, for this screencast, what we're focusing on is how do I target the specific HTML elements that I want to target using various CSS selectors. Okay, so you really have to have a good foundation in selecting HTML elements based on the element name, so the tag name, or the class, or the ID, and then as time goes on, we'll get comfortable using these combination-based selectors so that we can get a more targeted selection. So we can say we want all the list items inside an element that has an ID of grocery list. Or we can say all of the elements that have a class called highlighted inside the element that has an ID of cities. Or we're talking about all the paragraphs, all the divs, all the articles, all the sections. So we're grabbing them all at once and applying a common style rule to all of those HTML elements. So really the gist of this screencast is how do we deal with these selectors and really what are we selecting?